Begin in the dark, because that is where everything begins. Picture water, cold and slow and heavy with salt, and beneath it a floor of fine grey mud that has never once been looked at. For more than 3 billion years the sea has held life, and for almost all of that time the life inside it has been blind. Things drift, things filter the water, things settle into the mud and wait. There are patches of living cells here that can tell light from dark, the way your skin feels the warmth of the sun without ever seeing it. But in all the long history of the world, nothing has yet taken that light and turned it into a picture. Nothing has ever been seen. And then, in this particular stretch of ancient water, something moves differently. It is a swimmer, and at the front of it sit 2 great dark eyes, each one built from thousands of tiny facets that gather the dim light and pass it inward until, for the first time anywhere, the light becomes a shape, and the shape becomes a smaller creature just ahead, and the smaller creature becomes food. The swimmer turns, not by the push of the current, but because it has seen. Below it, the smaller thing feels the water bend around a body, closing in, and it runs. And so the oldest story there is, the hunter and the hunted, begins for the very first time in water that has only just learned how to look. This is the sea a little more than 500 million years ago in the chapter of Earth's history we call the Cambrian. And the thing about it that has unsettled nearly everyone who has ever studied it closely is not the strangeness of the creatures, though they are strange. It is the speed. For billions of years, life had stayed mostly small, mostly soft, mostly simple. And then, in a window so brief that against the vastness of deep time, it is barely a flicker, just a few million years, almost every basic body plan that animals still wear today shows up in the rock. Eyes and limbs, jaws and guts, the whole underlying architecture of what it means to be an animal, arriving very nearly at once. Mountains take longer to rise than this. A world with no eyes became, in a few million years of stone, a world entirely full of them. And from where we stand now, looking back, it can feel as though the ocean simply woke up, as though some hand reached in and threw a switch, as though the whole sea decided in a single morning to open its eyes and look around. But no hand reached in. Nothing decided anything. And here is the thought that will not be put down, the one that follows us into the quiet when we finally lie still at the end of the day. The watching and the watched did not arrive in that sea as separate things. The eye and the fear of the eye, the one who hunts and the one who flees, were settled into place in the very same handful of moments, and so, in a way you are about to feel, were you. Lie still and take stock of the body that is listening to this. 2 eyes at the front of your face, both pointed forward the way a hunter's eyes point. A left half that mirrors your right. A clear front and back, a top and a bottom, a mouth at one end, and a long dark passage running the length of you to the other. None of that had to be the way it is. It is a body plan, a basic blueprint for how an animal is built. And it is old, almost past imagining. Older than bone, older than the first footprint ever pressed into mud on land. It took shape in that watched sea, in those few crowded million years, and you have carried it unbroken every day since. The Cambrian is not a place you visit in a museum. It is the shape you are lying in right now. So the question underneath all of this is really very simple, and the honest truth is that no one has fully answered it. Did everything change all at once? A single key, turning in a single lock? Or had this been building for far longer than the stone is able to show us? Was it truly an explosion, or only the moment a long, slow fuse finally reached the powder? If the slow unfolding of deep time is the sort of thing that settles your mind at the end of a long day, you might think about subscribing so the next of these quiet journeys can find you. And before you drift off, here is a question worth carrying down into sleep. When you sit with everything that had to happen, in just the right order across 500 million years, for you to be here tonight listening in the dark, does it leave you feeling small or strangely, impossibly lucky? Leave your answer in the comments below. Every one of them is read. Because the answer, as much as we have one, is written in stone, kept in a few rare places on Earth where the soft and the delicate and the easily lost were somehow, against all odds, preserved. And the strangest part of the whole story is this. The first man ever to carry a piece of that lost world down out of the mountains held it in his hands, turned it over, and filed it away under names far too ordinary for what it truly was. It is the late summer of 1909, and a man is kneeling on a high, cold ridge in the Canadian Rockies, somewhere above the little railway town of Field, with a hammer in his hand and a slab of dark shale across his knees. His name is Charles Walcott, and he is one of the most important scientists in America, the head of the Smithsonian Institution, a man who has spent his whole life reading the stories that rock keeps. He taps the slab along its grain, the way you might pry open a book that has been glued shut for an age, and it parts cleanly into two faces. And there, pressed into the stone, thin and dark and perfect, lies the body of an animal that has been dead for more than 500 million years. Not a shell, not a bone, not a footprint, none of the hard leftovers that are almost the only things deep time bothers to keep. But the whole creature, its legs, its delicate gills, the fine fringe running along its sides, laid out in the rock like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. It was soft and complete and impossible. To understand why a man's hands might shake at a moment like that, you have to know how rarely the earth is ever this generous. Almost everything that has ever lived has vanished without leaving the faintest mark. Flesh rots, scavengers scatter what is left, and the soft majority of life, the worms, the swimmers, the jellied and the boneless, simply disappears, as though it had never been here at all. What usually survives is the hard remainder, a tooth, a shell, a knuckle of bone. So our entire picture of ancient life is built, most of the time, from the few stiff pieces that happen to last, like trying to know a great city from nothing but its doorknobs and its drainpipes. The Burgess Shale, for that is what this place would come to be called, is one of the rare cracks in that rule. Here, a little over 500 million years ago, animals living at the foot of a vast underwater cliff were caught now and then by slides of fine mud that swept them off their ledge and buried them, alive and whole, in the dark and airless ooze below. With no oxygen to feed decay and no scavengers to tear them apart, they did not rot in the ordinary way. They flattened and they stayed. Even the last meals inside them can sometimes still be made out. It is not a graveyard so much as a single held breath, a few moments of one ancient sea floor, sealed and kept, while all the rest of that world was allowed to dissolve. Walcott understood at once that he had found something extraordinary, and he gave the rest of his life to it. Over the years that followed, he came back again and again, quarrying the layer by hand, splitting the shale slab by slab, until he had shipped more than 60,000 specimens home to Washington, drawer after drawer of a lost world, packed in cotton and labeled in his own careful hand. By any measure, it was one of the greatest fossil hauls in history, and yet for all that he saved it, he never quite managed to see it. Because when Walcott looked at these creatures, he saw familiar faces. Here was something with jointed legs and a hard back, so he called it a kind of shrimp, a cousin of the horseshoe crab. Here was something long and segmented, so it was filed in with the worms. One by one, he sorted his impossible animals into the same tidy boxes that already held the living ones, and there they sat. It is easy now to call that a failure of imagination, but there is a deeper reason it was such an honest mistake. The very features that fooled him, The jointed limb, the gill, the compound eye, the armoured shell, are exactly the things that life arrives at over and over again in lineages that never met and could never have copied one another. If each of those were a stroke of singular genius, you would expect to find it once. Instead, you find it nearly everywhere, again and again, because the water, the chemistry, and the plain physics of being a small hunted thing leave only so many workable answers, and blind trial keeps stumbling back onto the same few. The repetition that misled Walcott is not the signature of a designer reusing a good idea. It is the opposite. The mark of a process with no memory at all, solving the same problem from scratch, over and over, and landing in the same place only because there was nowhere else to land. And yet, however strange they were, every one of these creatures shared something with the man turning them over in his hands, and with you. Each had a head end and a tail end, a front that met the world first, where the mouth and the senses gathered, and a long body trailing behind it. That single line of organization, running from front to back, mouth to far end, is one of the oldest patterns in the whole of animal life, and you are built upon it still, a head where you keep your eyes and your hunger, and a length of you that follows. Somewhere in those 60,000 specimens, filed under labels as plain as all the rest, lay creatures whose line runs without a single break all the way to the body listening to this. Though no one then, and for a long while afterward, would ever have thought to look twice at them. It took half a century and an entirely new set of eyes for the lost world to be recognized as lost. In the 1960s and 70s, a Cambridge paleontologist named Harry Whittington, working alongside two brilliant young research students, Simon Conway Morris and Derek Briggs, began taking Walcott's animals back out of their drawers and looking at them again, slowly and properly, without deciding in advance what they had to be. And one by one, the creatures refused to go back in. The thing Walcott had called a shrimp turned out to belong to no living group on Earth. Animal after animal, dissected in the rock and rebuilt on paper, proved far stranger and harder to place than anyone had let themselves believe. A whole menagerie of body plans, some with no obvious descendants and no name. When the biologist and writer Stephen Jay Gould carried this story to the wider world in his book Wonderful Life, he argued that the Burgess Shale was nothing less than proof that the history of life had been far stranger and far less inevitable than we had ever wanted it to be. Not everyone agreed with how far he took it. Conway Morris himself would come to insist the creatures were less alien than Gould made them sound. But the disagreement was the whole point. A drawer of ordinary shrimp had quietly become one of the great arguments in all of biology. That is the quiet vindication buried in this place. The treasure had been in our hands the entire time, hidden not by the earth but by our own certainty, misfiled for 50 years under names far too small to hold it. Walcott had carried a lost world down a mountain and gone to his grave, never knowing its true size. But there is a strange thing about lost worlds. Once you finally learn to look for one, you begin to suspect it was never the only one. And indeed, even as the argument over the Burgess Shale was climbing toward its height in the west, on the far side of the planet, in the soft green hills of southern China, the rains and the road cuttings were beginning to lay open rock that was older still, and that had cradled its dead even more tenderly than the mountains above field. For most of the last 100 years, if you wanted to stand at the dawn of the animal world and see it laid out whole in stone, there was really only one address worth knowing. It was that grey ridge in the Canadian Rockies, the first such window ever found, the most studied, the one that filled the textbooks and the museum halls and very nearly the entire imagination of a science. And it is easy, with famous things, to assume that the first window we found onto a lost world must also be the oldest and the clearest. It was neither. The proof of that turned up quietly and without much fanfare on a low hill in southern China in the summer of 1984. His name was Ho Xiangguang, a young paleontologist working the hills of Yunnan province, searching the rock for small Cambrian fossils of a fairly ordinary kind. What he found instead, in a band of fine mudstone near a hill called Ediacaran, was another lost world entirely. Soft-bodied animals set into the stone with the same impossible tenderness as the ones above field, but in rock around 518 million years old, older than the Burgess Shale by something like 10 million years, which is to say that the most celebrated record of the explosion was never the explosion's first chapter at all, but a later one, written 10 million years after the chapter that had been lying in China the whole time, waiting for someone to come and read it. And what was written there was, if anything, finer. The Burgess animals are mostly flattened films, beautiful but pressed thin. At Chengjiang, the preservation reaches deeper into the body. Here you can trace not just the outline of a creature, but its workings, the looping gut, the fans of its gills, the fine threads of its limbs, the dark stain where eyes once gathered light. In some specimens, researchers believe they can make out the nervous system itself. The cord that ran the length of the animal, the branching of its nerves, even in a handful of astonishing cases, the faint shadow of a brain. To look at such a thing is to see the actual wiring of an animal that died before there were any plants on land, before there was anything whatsoever walking the continents, kept for us not as bone, which it never owned, but as a ghost of carbon pressed into rock. You might think a record like that would be the final word. It was not. In 2019, a team of Chinese paleontologists, led by Fu Dongjing, announced that they had found, on a riverbank in Hubei province, a site of about the same great age that quietly outdid even Chengjiang. They called it Xinjiang. What makes it almost unbelievable is what it managed to keep. Not the relatively sturdy, leggy, armored animals that turn to stone most readily, but the very softest things the sea has ever made. Jellyfish, comb jellies, sea anemones, with their tentacles still spread as if waiting on a current. Creatures built from little more than water and the thinnest skin of membrane, the sort of thing that ordinarily dissolves within hours of dying and leaves behind nothing at all. And here they were, more than 500 million years later, with around half of every species entirely new to science. There is something worth sitting quietly with in all of this, and it is a little humbling. The story most of us were handed, the one built around a single ridge in Canada, found by a famous man at a famous institution, was never the whole of the truth, nor even the best of it. The Burgess Shale earned its fame honestly, but a fair share of that fame is simply an accident of timing and of volume. It was found first, in 1909, by someone with the full weight of the Smithsonian behind him, and in time, a celebrated book to carry its name around the world. The older and finer windows, the ones in China, were opened later and spoken of more softly, and so they sit nearer the edges of the popular story, even though they hold the deeper and clearer view. It is a quiet reminder that what we so confidently call knowledge of the deep past is shaped not only by what the rock happened to save, but by who happened to find it, and where, and whether anyone was listening when they did. And these windows tell us something beyond strange anatomy. The eyes, the brains, the trailing nerves all say the same thing in the same breath. By this point, more than 500 million years ago, the business of sensing the world and hunting within it was already old, already practiced, already fine. Whatever first lit the fuse, it had plainly been burning a good long while before any of these creatures settled into the dark. And one of the soft things these seas preserved so tenderly reaches further into you than you would ever guess. Swallow, just once, and pay attention to everything that moves. The muscles working in your throat, the small shift beneath the angle of your jaw, all the fine adjustments your body makes without ever being asked. That machinery carries a history far older than any human throat. Very early in your own life, when you were an embryo no bigger than a grain of rice, a series of small folds rose in a row along what would become your neck, one arch behind another. In a fish, those very same arches go on to frame the gills. In you, they were carried off in a completely different direction. They became the hinge of your jaw, the cartilage of your voice, and, most improbably of all, the three tiny bones, each no bigger than a grain of barley, that sit deep within each ear and let you hear a voice like this one. None of that was planned. Nothing reached into the embryo and designed a jaw or engineered an ear. An ancient set of supports, which in the first animals to own them did nothing but help with feeding and breathing, was simply taken up and put to wholly new work over and over across hundreds of millions of years. The exquisite fit of your jaw, the precision of your hearing, they wear the look of careful engineering, and they are nothing of the sort. They are hand-me-downs, second-hand parts, the same old gill arch material endlessly reworked by a process that never once knew where it was going. That is the humbling shape of this whole chapter, and maybe of the science itself. Every time we are certain we are holding the oldest and clearest record of the beginning, the earth clears its throat and sets an older, gentler one down in front of us. Which leaves a question that only grows heavier the more of these windows we pry open. If even the famous beginnings turn out to have beginnings hidden behind them, if the explosion already had eyes and brains and swift, hungry bodies the very moment we can first see it plainly, then what was happening in the long, dark stretch that came before? To go looking for that, we have to set the Cambrian down altogether and step back, tens of millions of years further still, into a world with no teeth, no hunters, and almost no violence in it at all. A strange and silent garden spread across the floor of the sea. On the floor of a shallow, dim sea, a little more than 550 million years ago, something is lying on the mud, and it is genuinely hard to know what to make of it. It is flat, almost impossibly flat, the way a fallen leaf is flat. An oval, perhaps the length of your hand, quilted all over with fine ribs that run from a midline out toward the edges, though if you look closely, the ribs on one side never quite line up with the ribs on the other, as though the whole creature had been printed slightly out of register. It does not crawl and it does not swim. It has no head, no eyes, no mouth that anyone has ever managed to find, and no front or back in any sense you would recognize. For a long time, no one could say with any confidence whether it was an animal, a fungus, a colony of something smaller, or a kind of life with no living relatives and no proper name at all. We call it Dickinsonia, and it is one of the strangest things ever lifted out of the rock, and it was far from alone. The world it lay in, a long reach of deep time we call the Ediacaran, after a range of low hills in Australia where these fossils were first noticed, was settled by a whole quiet menagerie of soft, simple, motionless things. There were fronds, like Charnia, anchored to the seafloor by a holdfast and standing upright in the slow current, feathered and gently swaying, for all the world like ferns in a garden that had never once seen the sun, since many of them lived far too deep for any light to reach. There were discs and bags and ribbed mattresses and shapes that resemble nothing alive today. And beneath all of it, covering very nearly the entire floor of the sea like a vast, wrinkled, slimy carpet, lay a living skin of microbes, the mat ground, the surface on which this whole world rested and fed. Researchers sometimes call it the Garden of Ediacaran, and the name is well earned, because that is precisely what it was. Still, soft, rooted, and almost wholly without violence. Nothing here had teeth because there was as yet nothing to bite. Nothing had armor because there was nothing to be defended against. Nothing had eyes because in all that dim and motionless world there was, for the moment, almost nothing worth the trouble of watching. These creatures did not chase and were not chased. Most of them simply lay or stood where they were and drew in what they needed, straight from the water and the mat around them, soaking up dissolved nourishment across the whole of their flattened surfaces. And that flatness is itself a kind of message, if you know how to read it. A body stretched thin and wide, with every cell held close to the outside world, is a body that only makes sense in a place with no urgency. No need to be quick, no need to be small and hidden, no need to wrap yourself in anything hard. The very shape of these animals is the signature of an absence, the absence of the single pressure that would, before very long, reshape everything. Nothing out there was trying to eat them. For decades, the deepest question about the garden was whether any of it counted as animal life at all, or whether these were some entirely separate experiment that the Earth ran once and then abandoned. The answer, at least for one of them, arrived in 2018, when researchers managed to draw out of a Dickinsonia fossil the faint molecular traces of cholesterol, a particular kind of fat that in such quantities essentially only animals produce. It was a fingerprint left at the scene more than 500 million years after the fact, and it settled the matter. Dickinsonia, whatever else it may have been, was an animal. Which means that lying there on the mat, flat and faceless and strange, was something you can honestly call a distant relative. A member, however impossibly far removed, of the very same great family the body listening to this belongs to. But the garden was never going to stay a garden, and the first hint of its ending is written very faintly into the mat itself. Among the soft and the still there was one creature, called Cambrian, that was different in a way that would turn out to matter enormously. It was small and slug-like, and it could move, and more than that, it could feed in a wholly new manner. Around the fossils of Cambrian, paleontologists find something they find nowhere before it: little fan-shaped scratches raked into the ancient mat, the marks of a creature dragging some kind of rasping mouthpart across the microbial carpet and scraping it up to eat. They are, as far as we know, among the very first feeding marks in the entire history of animals, the first clear sign of one living thing actively, deliberately consuming another. It does not look like much, a few faint scrapes in the mud, but it is the moment hunger first acquired an edge. And Cambrian left you something far more lasting than a metaphor. The creature that rasped at the mat had a thing the fronds and the flat absorbers did not: a proper gut, a tube with a mouth at one end and an opening at the other, down which food could travel in a single direction, breaking down along the way and leaving as waste. A one-way passage threaded the length of the body. Lay a hand on your own stomach for a moment and feel, if you can, the slow work going on in there. The steady, patient, one-way movement of everything you have ever eaten, passing down the very same kind of tube that a small Ediacaran grazer was already dragging across the mat more than 550 million years ago. That through gut was a true innovation, and it proved so successful that very nearly every animal since has been built around one. But here is the catch, and it is a telling one. Once the tube became the body's basic plan, the body was committed to it forever, because evolution can never tear a design down to its foundations and begin again. It can only renovate. And so your digestive system is rather like a house that has been lived in and added onto for 500 million years without ever once being demolished. Every new owner forced to build on the last owner's choices, pipes threaded through walls where they were never meant to run, a valve at the top of the stomach that still lets acid seep up into your chest simply because no one was ever able to move it. The elegance of the gut and its small daily indignities flow from exactly the same source. It was never engineered at all. It was only, across 500 million years, endlessly made do with. That, in the end, is the tender and faintly unsettling thing about the Garden of Ediacaran. It was real, and it was peaceful, and it endured for an immense stretch of time. Tens of millions of years of softness and stillness, many times longer than the entire span our own kind has walked the earth. And it was never made to last, because we are not the children of the peace. We are the children of the thing that broke it. The fronds and the flat absorbers, the quilted ovals with no faces, would nearly all be gone before long, swept under by a coming world of mouths and eyes and speed that was, even now, in the faintest possible way, beginning to stir. And for the moment, in the dim and the silence, the only mark of everything that was on its way was a small fan of scratches in the mat, where something had begun ever so gently to eat. There is a kind of fossil that no museum will ever put behind glass. It is not a fearsome claw, or a great staring eye, or a creature flattened whole into slate. It is a speck, a fleck of mineral a millimeter or two across, a tiny tube, a little button, a curved sliver like a clipping from a fingernail, the sort of thing you could lose in the seam of your sleeve and never notice was gone. Geologists give these unglamorous scraps an equally unglamorous name, the small shelly fossils. And yet these dull little flecks, sieved by the thousand out of crushed and dissolved rock, managed something that none of the spectacular Burgess animals ever could. They quietly dismantled the idea that the great burst of animal life had come out of nowhere. To see why, you have to sit for a moment with the word sudden, because it is doing an enormous amount of work and not all of it honest. When we say the animal world appeared suddenly, what we usually mean is that it appeared suddenly in the rock, that one moment the stone is nearly empty of animals, and the next it is crowded with them. But the rock is not a neutral witness. It keeps the hard and loses the soft. It keeps the large and overlooks the small. It keeps the lucky few that were buried fast and lets everything else quietly rot away. For most of the history of life, animals were soft and small and rare, and so they left almost nothing of themselves behind. It is entirely possible, and for a long while it was genuinely unclear, that a great deal of the Cambrian's apparent suddenness is really the suddenness of becoming visible, of bodies, more or less all at once, growing big enough and hard enough to leave a mark at all. And when you look hard at the moment of the explosion itself, even the rock refuses to hand over a single clean bang. Those small shelly fossils do not all turn up together in one layer, the way you would expect of a true instant. They arrive in a slow procession, spread across millions of years, a few simple kinds at first, then more elaborate ones laid down on top, a gradual thickening of life rather than one decisive burst. The burrows tell the same patient story, shallow, timid scratches low in the rock, growing deeper and busier and more intricate as you climb upward through the layers, as though the world were slowly learning to dig. And the picture is still being drawn even now. New fossil beds keep surfacing, some described only in 2026, from the Jiangchuan district of southern China, each adding another rung to that slow ascent rather than a single leap. Whatever happened here, it did not happen in a morning. The closer you look, the more the one blinding flash dissolves into a long, graded dawn. The deepest evidence of all, though, is not in the rock at all. It is inside you. Every living thing carries, written into its DNA, a kind of slow and imperfect clock, because the genetic code picks up small random changes at a roughly steady rate as the generations pass. Two lineages that split from a shared ancestor will drift apart in their genes by an amount that grows with the time since they parted. Count the differences between two living animals, calibrate the rate as carefully as you can against the fossils you do have, and you can estimate how long ago their branches divided, even when no fossil of that division has ever been found. And when geneticists run that clock backwards for the great limbs of the animal family tree, the line that leads to insects and the line that leads to you, and the mollusks, the worms, the starfish, and all the rest, the genes insist, almost stubbornly, that these groups had already gone their separate ways tens of millions of years, and by some estimates a great deal longer, before a single one of them left a recognizable body in the stone. The honest truth is that we still argue about just how wide that gap is. Clocks can run fast or slow, and the disagreements are real and far from settled. But the direction of the answer is not in any doubt. The great parting happened in the dark, long before the rock is willing to show it, and you are carrying in the genes of every cell a faint record of a separation older than any fossil of it that survives, which brings us to the strangest illusion of the whole affair, and the one most worth taking apart. Seen from a distance, the explosion has the awful neatness of something planned. Lineage after lineage, with no contact and no kinship close enough to coordinate them, the ancestors of crabs, of snails, of sea stars, of fish, all seem to surge into complexity at very nearly the same moment, as if a single switch had been thrown for the whole of animal life at once. It is almost impossible not to read intention into that, not to feel that something somewhere called time and started the race. But there was no switch and no starting gun. What looks like one orchestrated event is really many separate lineages independently crossing similar thresholds because they were all living through the same changing world and meeting the same new conditions with the same few workable answers. The synchrony is not the fingerprint of a plan, it is convergence. The unsurprising outcome of a great many runners, none of them aware of the others, all finding the same low gap in the same long wall at roughly the same time, simply because that is where the wall happened to be lowest. And the fuse itself, that long, slow burn we have been tracing, is a story we can only ever tell backwards. Nothing was burning toward anything. There was no powder waiting at the end. Each small step, the first gut, the first scrape, the first mineral scrap, the first deeper burrow, happened for its own immediate sake in its own moment, with no inkling whatsoever of the blast we now place at the finish line. We call it a fuse because we already know how the story turns out. The Cambrian did not. So the paradox that has haunted this whole question turns out to dissolve quite gently the moment you stop asking the rock to be one single thing. The explosion was real. There genuinely was a stretch of time, geologically brief, when the pace of change ran hot and the basic architectures of animal life were settled in a hurry. And the fuse was real too, a build-up so long and so quiet that most of it took place where no fossil could ever record it, in soft bodies and small changes and the slow ratcheting of one creature's hunger raising the stakes for the next. Both were true at once. The blast was fast, but the making of it took an immensity of time that the human mind, which calls a single century history, can barely begin to hold. There is a particular kind of awe in that. Not the loud awe of an instant of creation, but the slower, more patient awe of realizing how much deep and unhurried time stood behind a thing we once imagined had happened all in a single dawn. But it leaves the hardest question of the entire story still sitting open, and it is one the animals themselves can never answer. If the makings of the explosion, the genes, the appetites, the half-built bodies, had been quietly assembling for tens of millions of years, then whatever finally let it run was not inside the animals at all. The trigger lay out in the world around them. Something in the sea itself, or in the sky above it, had to change before any of this could catch. And one of the oldest and most stubborn suspects is the simplest thing imaginable, the very thing you have done without a single thought, perhaps a dozen times since this sentence began, the drawing of a breath. Take a slow breath and hold it for just a moment before you let it go. Even now, before you have reached the end of this sentence, that mouthful of air is being carried down into the dark behind your ribs and handed off to something waiting there. And in millions upon millions of places at once, deep in the interior of your body, it is being spent to keep a vast number of very small fires burning. That, in the plainest possible terms, is what you are. A warm, slow-burning fire that has somehow learned to get up and walk around, and fire of every kind obeys one iron law before all the others. It cannot burn without air. No air, no fire, and no fire, no warmth, no movement, no largeness, no speed, none of the expensive, energetic business of being a big and active animal at all. This is not some small detail tucked away in the chemistry. It is one of the hard ceilings that hangs over the whole of life. To be large is to be costly, because a big body holds a great volume of cells buried deep inside it, far from the water and the air, every one of them needing to be fed and supplied, and the bigger you grow, the harder that hidden interior becomes to reach. To be active, to chase, to flee, to dig, to hunt, is costlier still, because muscle that works hard devours energy at a furious rate, and that energy can be paid for in only one way, by burning fuel with oxygen. When there is little oxygen to be had, the ceiling sits very low indeed. You can be small, you can be thin and flat, so that no cell is ever far from the outside. You can lie still and sip your nourishment gently from the water. Which is to say that the quiet, flattened, motionless garden we wandered through a little while ago, all those soft ovals and rooted fronds, drawing in what they needed across their whole surfaces and almost never stirring, was not only peaceful, it was, in some real part, a world living pressed up hard against a low and unforgiving ceiling in an ocean that simply could not yet afford anything bolder. So the obvious question is where the air came from, and the answer is one of the great reversals in the whole of this story. It is tempting, breathing as easily as you do, to feel that the world had somehow been made ready for creatures like us. The air laid on in advance, the atmosphere prepared, as though a long preparation had been quietly underway for our arrival. But nothing was prepared, and no one was expected. The oxygen in that ancient sea and the oxygen filling your lungs at this very moment is not a provision at all. It is a waste product. Billions of years ago, certain microbes in the ocean stumbled into a way of feeding on sunlight, and as they fed, they breathed out oxygen as exhaust, a reactive, corrosive gas that to most of the life of that time was nothing less than poison. The slow accumulation of all that exhalation was, by some reckonings, the single largest pollution crisis the planet has ever suffered. A poisoning of the entire world by the living things inside it. The breathable air we treat as the very emblem of a welcoming earth is, in plain truth, the ancient exhaust of creatures who never knew that we were coming. We did not inherit a world built for us. We learned, very late and very gradually, to live on somebody else's waste. And the learning of it is written all through your body, in machinery so old it predates animals entirely. Follow that held breath inward and watch where it goes. In your lungs, the oxygen is seized by hemoglobin, an iron-bearing protein folded into your red blood cells and the very reason your blood runs red, which carries it off, cell by cell, into every furthest corner of you. A close cousin of that protein, called myoglobin, holds a reserve of oxygen waiting in your muscles. Both belong to a single ancient family of oxygen-catching molecules so old that versions of it turn up in plants, in bacteria, in creatures right across the tree of life. And the final destination of that breath, the place where the air is actually spent, is stranger than any of it. Deep inside almost every one of your cells sit tiny structures called mitochondria, the small furnaces where fuel and oxygen are at last brought together and burned. They were not originally yours. They are the descendants of free-living bacteria swallowed whole and kept alive inside a larger cell, something like 2 billion years ago, and never let go, and they still carry a scrap of their own separate DNA to prove it. So the path of a single breath, from your chest to the place it is finally consumed, runs through a borrowed protein older than animals and ends inside a captive bacterium older still. You are not so much a thing that breathes as a vast walking partnership of ancient breathers, and you have been one all along. All of which might suggest a tidy little story. The air rose, the ceiling lifted, and the animals came pouring through the gap. And here, in all honesty, is where the firm ground gives way beneath our feet. Because the truth is that no one alive has ever measured the air of that vanished ocean, and no one ever can. Everything we believe we know about how much oxygen those early seas held is read at second hand, from faint chemical traces locked away in ancient rock, and those traces are subtle and damaged by the long passage of time, and they do not all tell the same story. Some of them say oxygen climbed steeply right before the explosion, as if precisely on cue. Others suggest it had been high enough for a long age already, which would mean it was never the trigger at all, but only the standing permission. And there is a genuinely unsettling possibility lurking beneath both, that we have the cause and the effect turned the wrong way around, and that it was the animals themselves, once they began to move and burrow and churn the sea and remake its chemistry, who helped to lift the very oxygen we are so eager to credit for lifting them. We do not know. After decades of patient work, the most honest thing a careful scientist can say is that oxygen was almost certainly necessary, and almost certainly not the whole of the answer, and that the exact shape of its role is still being argued over to this day. But strip the argument back to what is solid, and something quietly astonishing is still left standing. Whatever the timing, whatever it was that lit what, the plain physics is beyond all dispute. A body like yours, large, warm, awake, expensive, able to cross a room or run down a meal, simply cannot exist in an airless world. Your size is not a triumph of will, and it is not a gift that was wrapped and set aside in advance for you. It is a kind of permission. And the strange truth is that no one ever signed it. The air did not decide to allow you. It merely, after billions of years, stopped saying no, and into that opening in time poured everything the risen air could finally hold. And yet an opened door is not a house. The fact that a thing has at last become possible is a very long way indeed from the fact of its being built. The risen air could permit a large, complex, active animal. It could not, by itself, supply the faintest knowledge of how to assemble one, where to set the head, how to repeat a segment down a body, when to raise a limb, and exactly where. That knowledge lay nowhere out in the chemistry of the sea. It was already written in a language far older than the Cambrian, coiled up small and dark and patient inside the living cell itself. Lie still and trace the long line that runs the length of you, the crown of the head at one end, and far away at the other, low at the base of the spine, the small vestige of a tail you will never see. Between those 2 points, everything is arranged in order: head, then neck, then the long graded series of the trunk. And that ordering, front to back, is among the oldest decisions any animal ever inherited. What is stranger and harder to hold in the mind as sleep comes on is that the order is written down. Coiled in the dark of almost every cell you carry, on the thread-like chromosomes folded smaller than thought, there sits a short row of genes laid out in the same sequence as your body itself. The ones near the start of the row speak for the head. The ones further along speak for the neck, the chest, the lower back, in turn. The body's map and the gene's order are the same map. Read the row from one end to the other, and you are reading yourself, head to tail. These are the Hox genes, and the tidy correspondence, gene order matching body order is called collinearity, a word that does little justice to how uncanny the thing is. The genes do not merely sit in the right sequence, they switch on in that sequence too, front first, as the embryo lays itself down from head towards tail, so that the building of the body follows the reading of the list. Each Hox gene is not a blueprint for an organ, but something closer to an instruction of identity. It tells a band of cells not what to make, but where they are. You are the head end, behave accordingly, you are the middle, you are the rear. Everything those cells then build, they build because they have first been told which region of the animal they belong to. You can feel how deep this runs by watching what happens when the instruction is wrong. The geneticist Edward Lewis spent the better part of his life on a single small fly, the fruit fly, breeding generation after generation and reading the rare deformities that appeared, and what he found was that a fault in one of these regional instructions did not produce a smear of damage, but a clean, almost architectural substitution. In the mutation called antennapedia, a fly grows a pair of perfectly formed legs from its head, in the sockets where its antennae should be. Not broken antennae, but legs, complete and jointed, sprouting from the face, because a region was told it was the leg-bearing thorax, when it was in fact the head. In another, called bithorax, the small balancing organs behind the wings are converted into a second pair of wings, and a two-winged fly becomes, briefly and impossibly, a four-winged one. Nothing new was invented in these creatures. A switch had simply been thrown in the wrong place, and the body obeyed the order it was given, faithfully and to the letter. For a long time it was possible to imagine that this was a private trick of insects. It is not. In the years around 1984, working in a laboratory in Basel and in others racing alongside it, researchers found that the Hox genes share a short, near-identical stretch of code, the homeobox, and then found that same stretch not only in flies but in frogs, in mice, in us. The discovery had the quality of a door opening onto a room no one knew was there. The same head-to-tail logic that orders the fly orders you. The genes are not identical, and the bodies they build could hardly look less alike, but the underlying grammar is one grammar, conserved across more than 500 million years and across nearly every animal that has a front and a back. Biologists came to call this kind of buried, shared machinery deep homology, and it is the reason a defect mapped in a fly can illuminate a disorder in a human child. It is tempting, lying here, to hear all this as a program, as though somewhere in the deep past a complete set of instructions for building intricate animals had been composed and set aside, waiting for the moment the world was ready to run it. That is the natural reading, and it is the wrong one. The toolkit is far older than the elaborate bodies it now specifies. These regional identity genes arose in animals far simpler than any Cambrian creature, soft, modest things that needed only to tell their front from their back, and they were kept not because anything was coming, but because telling one's front from one's back is useful to almost any animal that moves. What happened later was not invention, but redeployment. A gene, once copied by the ordinary accidents of duplication, leaves a spare. The spare is free to be switched on somewhere new, conscripted to a task it was never first selected for, and the cluster of Hox genes grew in just this way by copying and recruiting an old solution pressed again and again into fresh service. The developmental biologist Eric Davidson spent his career drawing the wiring diagrams behind this, the gene regulatory networks, with their ancient, almost untouchable cores and their looser, ever-rewired edges. And what the diagrams show is that the Cambrian did not need a vast new vocabulary of genes so much as a rewiring of the genes already in hand. A switch moved, a connection added, a familiar instruction read out in a new place and a new time. That is also why so much could change so fast. Because the system is modular, Because identity is parceled into regions, and regions can be altered one at a time, pressure can act on a single part of an animal without dismantling the rest. A segment can be lengthened, a region repurposed, an appendage shifted, and the remainder of the body holds its shape. The same architecture that makes a body stable enough to inherit makes it supple enough to be reworked, and selection, working not on the genes themselves so much as on when and where they speak, could turn modest variations in timing and place into the great range of forms now crowding the warming sea. There is a particular vertigo in this, the kind that arrives just at the edge of sleep. The recognition that the rules of your own body were drafted long before there were bodies of this kind to obey them. The order of you was settled in creatures you would not recognize as kin, for reasons that had nothing to do with you, and you are running tonight on instructions you did not write and that were never written for you. And yet, for all the power folded into that small coiled row, there is something it cannot do. The instructions can specify an animal of real intricacy, front and rear, top and bottom, segment after segment, set faithfully in its place. And every last thing they specify comes into the world soft. The genome can draw a complete and beautiful body and still set it down naked into the water. In a sea that had only lately acquired the habit of eating other animals, a soft body, however well built, is simply a well-made meal, and the better the building, the more there is worth eating. The deep problem of the age was no longer how to assemble a body. It was how to keep one, how to make some part of yourself too hard to bite. And the answer, when it came, would be drawn not from the language of genes at all, but from the plainest chemistry of the sea, from minerals dissolved in the very water the animal was struggling to survive. In the last few million years before the Cambrian properly began, in warm, shallow water that survives today as rock in Namibia and Oman and the hills of southern China, a small animal called Claudina built itself a shelter out of the sea. It had no head worth the name, no limbs, in all likelihood no eyes. It was little more than a stack of thin mineral cones, one nested inside the next like a run of paper cups, each ring a fresh wall of calcium carbonate drawn straight out of the water and set down around the soft body within. Named in the last century for the geologist Preston Cloud, it is among the very first creatures known to have worn a hard skeleton at all. And here is the part that lingers. In some of those little tubes, punched cleanly through the mineral wall, there are holes, round, neat, each one sized to whatever made it, the unmistakable mark of something that had learned to drill. The oldest armor we know of reaches us already defeated. The wall and the thing that opens the wall enter the record together, almost in the same breath, as if hardness and the undoing of hardness were a single invention, seen from two sides. When the Cambrian itself opened, the trick refused to stay rare. Across lineages that had not shared an ancestor in a very long time, mollusks and lamp shells and sponges and a crowd of small creatures known mostly from the mineral scales they shared across the seabed, the laying down of skeleton appeared, and appeared again by chemical roots that owed nothing to one another. Some animals built in calcium carbonate, the stuff of chalk and limestone. Some in calcium phosphate, harder and dearer to make. Some in silica, ordinary glass spun out into needles and stars. There were creatures whose whole defense was a coat of hundreds of separate little plates, a sheath of mineral scales worn over the back so that the body could flex and creep, and yet remain, at every point along its length, clad in stone. Elsewhere, a sponge, doing none of this for protection at all, drew silica from the water and grew a lattice of glass so fine and so geometric that the very same shapes are still being spun on the deep seabed tonight. Why the habit should have caught so widely, and just then, is a question with two answers that happen to point the same way. The water itself had changed. The slow machinery of the planet had altered what the sea held, lifting the dissolved calcium and the other raw makings of a skeleton until mineral was easier to bring out of solution than it had ever been. And the living world had changed alongside it, for it had filled with mouths. To an animal that nothing hunts, a skeleton is a costly extravagance. To an animal in water that has learned to eat its own kind, that same skeleton is the whole difference between leaving descendants and leaving none. A permissive chemistry and a lethal ecology arrived in the same few million years, and between them they made hardness at once possible and worth the having. It is worth slowing on what that laying down of mineral really is, because some version of it is going on inside you as you lie here. To raise a shell, or a plate, or a spine, an animal draws dissolved calcium out of the surrounding water, marries it to carbonate or to phosphate, and coaxes the pair to crystallize in an ordered lattice, hardness set down with great precision here and withheld there, a feat of controlled chemistry carried out at body temperature in salt water by living tissue. Press your tongue now to the back of a tooth. Draw a thumbnail along the front of your shin, where the bone lies close beneath the skin. That hardness, the least yielding part of you, is calcium phosphate, the mineral called apatite, grown in ordered crystal in much the way those early animals grew theirs. Some of them, the lamp shells, a few of which still live today, anchored quietly to the seafloor, fashioned their paired valves out of that very phosphate, the same chemistry your own skeleton would one day be hung upon. The kinship is not a straight line of descent. The first true bones and the first true teeth lay tens of millions of years further on, reached by separate roads. What is shared is older and quieter than any bone, the knowing of how to take the sea's dissolved stone and make it flesh his own. And it is in that older knowing that the strangest turn of the whole story hides itself. It is the most natural thing in the world to look at a shell and see a shield, to suppose that the entire apparatus of mineral making arose because animals needed defending and so built themselves walls to meet the need. But a wall is almost certainly not what the machinery was first for. Calcium, the very element at the heart of nearly every skeleton, is within a living cell a kind of poison. The cell keeps its inner calcium fanatically low because it leans on the ion as a signal and a trigger, and a flood of it where it does not belong throws every switch at once and is lethal. Every cell you own spends a portion of its energy, every second of your life, pumping calcium out and shutting spare calcium safely away. A discipline as old as complex life, far older than any animal with a body to protect. To take that ancient housekeeping, that ceaseless, careful disposal of a dangerous surplus, and tip it over into the deliberate building of structure is a short step in chemistry and a vast one in consequence. The shell did not begin as a shield. In its deepest root, it looks far more like a way of putting out the rubbish, of turning a toxic excess into something a body could set down and be rid of. And only afterwards, with the stuff already being laid down, did the animals that happened to lay it where it blunted a blow survive a little more often, and leave a few more of their kind than the animals that did not. Once hardness was loose in the world, though, it could not be kept to one side of the fight. The same trick that walled one animal in let another tip itself with a point. The mineral that thickened into a shell could just as well be drawn into a spine, a grasping hook, a hardened ridge at the rim of a mouth, and the borer that punched those first holes through Claudina was nothing more than biomineralization read backwards. This is what a shell will never admit about itself. That armor and the weapon which beats armor are the same discovery, one stone sharpened towards two ends, and that from the moment it appeared the sea was bound into a spiral with no way out. Thicker walls summoning stronger jaws and stronger jaws summoning thicker walls, every gain on the one side inscribed as a cost into the bodies of the other. And mineral is never cheap. It takes energy and material to raise, it is heavy to haul, it slows a body in the water. No creature pays that toll for nothing. So a hard skeleton is never merely a structure, it is testimony. Every Cambrian shell that has reached us is a small fossil confession that, out in the water it was drawn from, something had grown dangerous enough to make the expense worth bearing. The soft sea was gone, and it would not return. In its place lay a world of made things and breached things, of walls raised and walls opened, the two forever wedded because they had only ever been one idea. You hold the settlement of that ancient quarrel in you yet, in the hardness along your gums, in the long bones that let you stand, the far inheritance of the first animals to gather the sea into stone, and so to become, at a single stroke, both harder to kill and better furnished for the killing. The water has carried hard things ever since. There is one organ that has always seemed to settle the argument before it begins. Rest a fingertip for a moment against your closed eyelid, here in the dark, and feel the small, firm curve of the eye beneath it. A clear window at the front, a lens behind that, a chamber of jelly, and at the very back a screen of living tissue wired straight into the brain, the whole apparatus swiveling and focusing and adjusting to the faint light of this room many times a second without your ever asking it to. It looks, by any honest reckoning, like a made thing. It looks like an instrument, built by someone who understood optics for the express purpose of seeing, and for most of human history that was taken as plain proof that someone had. An eye, the old argument ran, no more assembles itself than a telescope grinds its own glass. Charles Darwin felt the force of this keenly. In the book that founded the whole of what we now understand, he admitted that to suppose the eye could have been formed by natural selection seemed, in his own phrase, freely confessed, absurd in the highest possible degree. It is a remarkable thing for a man to write of his own theory, but he wrote it in order to take it apart, and the dismantling, once you follow it through, is total, because the apparent perfection of the eye, the very quality that seems to cry out for a designer, turns out to be the strongest evidence we have that no designer was needed at all. Begin with the smallest possible beginning, a single molecule that happens to change its shape when a particle of light strikes it. Such molecules are ancient, older by far than any eye, older than the Cambrian, opsins they are called, and a version of them is folded into the back of your own eye at this instant, quietly soaking up the dimness of the room. Scatter a few of these into a bare patch of skin, and the animal that owns them can suddenly tell light from dark, which is already worth a great deal. It can find its way up towards the surface, sense the turning of the day, flinch from the sudden shadow of something passing overhead. Dish that flat patch into a shallow cup, and the direction the light comes from begins to matter, because the cup's own rim throws shade across part of the screen. Deepen the cup and draw in its mouth, and you have at the limit a pinhole, and a pinhole, as any darkened room with one small bright opening will show you, casts a true if dim image on the wall behind it. Flood that opening with clear jelly to keep the silt out. Thicken the jelly at its center into a lens, and the image leaps into brightness and sharpness. Not one of those steps asks for foresight. Not one of them needs the finished eye to justify it. Each is a small improvement on the step before, useful the very moment it appears. Two Swedish biologists, Dan Erik Nilsson and Susanne Pelger, once set out to time this journey, and they did it pessimistically on purpose, allowing each generation only the most miserly sliver of improvement so that no one could accuse them of hurrying the answer. Even so starved, their model crawled the whole way from a flat, light-sensitive patch to a fully focused camera eye in something on the order of 364,000 generations for a small creature breeding once a year, a few 100,000 years, an interval the rock can barely resolve, a single tick of the deep clock. The eye is not the slow and staggering improbability it was always assumed to be. Given light and time reckoned in the cheapest currency evolution owns, it is very nearly easy. And then comes the detail that turns the old argument inside out. If the eye were a bespoke marvel, the signed work of a maker, you would expect to find it made once. Instead, it has been made over and over, independently, by lineages that never once shared an eye between them. By most counts, somewhere between 40 and 60 separate times across the animal kingdom. Your own camera eye, a single lens throwing an image onto a sheet of receptors, was arrived at all over again, entirely separately, by the octopus and the squid, whose eyes resemble yours so closely that the likeness was for a long while a real puzzle, until it became plain that they had simply solved the same problem with the same physics, from scratch. The arthropods went another road and raised the compound eye, a dome of many small fixed tubes. Scallops line their eyes with living mirrors. The nautilus never got past the pinhole and looks out, to this day, through an eye with no lens in it at all. The constraints here are physics, not biology. Light bends by fixed rules, an image can be formed in only a few ways, so the paths to a working eye are few and keep being found again. A designer does not reinvent the same device 60 times over. A blind process, run again and again against the unchanging facts of light, does exactly that. And so the very repetition that ought to look like genius is instead the surest fingerprint of a mechanism with no mind in it, feeling its way to the handful of answers the world permits. Yet beneath all that independent invention, there runs something genuinely shared, and it is here that the wonder deepens rather than dissolves. The eyes are not the same eye. They are built to different plans, from different tissues, on different principles. But the deepest instruction behind them is a single instruction. There is a master gene called PAX6, whose whole office is to say, in effect, build an eye here, and it is so old and so faithfully conserved that you can lift the version out of a mouse, switch it on in the wrong region of a fruit fly, and the fly will dutifully grow eyes wherever the gene is told to fire. Fly eyes, properly compound, not mouse eyes, but eyes all the same, summoned by a mammal's command. The light-catching opsin in your retina and the opsin in that fly's are two variations on one ancestral molecule. What the common ancestor of all these creatures carried was not an eye, but the makings of one, a scrap of light-sensitive tissue and the genetic switch that governs it. And each lineage, inheriting that ancient kit, went on to build its own organ around it. Shared switch, separate eyes. The toolkit is one toolkit, the instruments are convergent, and the eye you are reading these words with stands at the end of both stories at once. For most of this history, the eyes themselves are gone, rotted away with the soft flesh that held them, and we read them only from the wiring they left behind. But the Cambrian, generous as ever to those that armored themselves, handed down a few eyes we can actually hold. The trilobites saw through lenses of stone. Each of their eyes was a close-packed array of hundreds of tiny lenses, and every lens was a single clear crystal of calcite, the same mineral as chalk and marble, grown clear and aligned so that light ran straight through it, so that these animals watched their world through windows of rock, and because the lenses were mineral in life, they survive as mineral in death. You can set a Cambrian trilobite under a microscope today and peer down the very lenses an animal used 500 million years ago, along the exact line its gaze once ran. Each lens caught a single point of the scene, the way each tile of a great mosaic or each pixel of a screen held far too close to the face carries only its own small fleck of the whole. Together they delivered a coarse, wide, motion-hungry picture of the seabed, very poor at fine detail and superbly good at noticing that something had moved. Step back far enough and you can see what the coming of eyes did to the whole of life, and it amounted to nothing less than a change of regime. The biologist Andrew Parker has made the case that vision was not merely one more product of the Cambrian upheaval, but among its engines, a light switch thrown across the living world. Consider what alters the instant the first capable eye opens. A hunter that can see may choose its target, follow it, close the gap with intent. The soft and the slow are no longer safe in the simple old way, safe by the mere indifference of a world that could not look at them. And everything else, in that same instant, becomes visible, laid bare across open water with nowhere in the daylight to go. The answers came quickly and are with us yet. Bodies turned glassy and all but transparent, skins that match the gloom exactly. Whole communities that sink each dawn into the deep dark and rise to feed only under cover of night. The escalation in shell and spine that had begun to grip the seas now had every reason to race, because Armour answers a danger that can single you out from clear across the reef. For something close to 3 billion years, life had carried on unseen, registering the world only by touch and chemistry and the faint warmth of light on a patch of skin. And then, in one thin sliver of time, the sea opened its eyes, and to be alive was suddenly to be watched. There is a particular vertigo in it even now, lying here in the dark. The thought of that first morning when the living world looked up and for the very first time looked back. And of all the eyes the age left behind, the most arresting were found quite alone, with no body attached to them, in the Emu Bay Shale on Kangaroo Island off the southern coast of Australia. They are a matched pair, each a great rounded dome, and each dome is assembled from something like 16,000 separate lenses, far more than any trilobite, far keener, an instrument plainly built for the hunt, for picking a small fleeing shape out against the bright ceiling of the sea. We found the eyes long before we could be certain of the creature behind them, and there is something fitting in that order of things, the gaze preserved while its owner kept to the shadow. For these were not the eyes of the hunted. Somewhere in that same warm water, just past the edge of the light, moved the thing those eyes were made to serve. The first of the truly great hunters, drifting up out of the dimness with the whole of the newly visible world spread open before it. Lie in the place of one of the small armored animals on the Cambrian floor for a moment and feel the new shape of the danger. For the whole of the long ages before, peril had come from below you or beside you. A borer working at your shell, a neighbour's grasping limb, the slow, indifferent chemistry of a bad patch of water. Now it came from above, and it came with intent. Out over the reef, up in the open water that almost nothing had yet learned to master, a shape moved that did not crawl. A broad, flattened body driven by a fringe of soft flaps that rippled down each side in travelling waves, a pair of great stalked eyes that swept the brightness for the smallest fleeing thing, and slung beneath those eyes two long, segmented, spine-studded appendages that reached and folded and reached again. This was the pressure that every earlier defense had been bracing for without ever knowing its face. This was Anomalocaris, and for a long time we have called it the first great hunter of the world. The name itself is a confession, and it is worth pausing on, because very nearly everything we once said about this animal has had to be taken back at least once. Anomalocaris means, close enough, the abnormal shrimp, and it was christened from a single piece. One of those spiny frontal appendages found on its own in Canadian rock and described in the 1890s by the paleontologist Joseph Whiteaves as the curled, segmented tail of some large shrimp. It was an honest reading of a fragment, and it was wrong, and the error did not stop there. The circular, toothed mouth, when it surfaced, was catalogued separately as a stranded jellyfish. The trunk was filed as a sponge or a sea cucumber. For the better part of a century, the animal lay scattered across 3 corners of the Tree of Life under 3 different names. A single predator dismembered not by any other creature, but by our own confident sorting. Only in the 1980s, when Harry Whittington and Derek Briggs sat down with the pieces and let the rock argue back, did the 3 supposed species fold together into one. The shrimp was an arm, the jellyfish was the mouth that arm fed, and the sponge was the body that carried both. Reassembled, it is a genuinely new kind of thing for its world. Where almost everything else of the age clung to the floor, crawling, burrowing, anchored, grazing, this animal owned the open water, swimming freely above the seabed on those rippling lateral flaps, an active hunter moving in 3 dimensions at a time when the 3rd dimension was very nearly empty. The flaps beat, not all at once, but in sequence, a single smooth wave running from front to back along each flank so that it held itself steady and slid forward at once, tireless, built for the long, patient cruise. Its great eyes, the same outsized, many-lensed eyes that had so lately opened upon the living world, gave it the reach to pick a target from clear across the bright water. Its frontal appendages gave it the means to take one. Lift your own hand now in the dark and close it slowly, and feel the fingers curl in towards the palm, the whole limb folding to draw something held at its tip back in towards you. The hunter's appendages did just this, segment hinging against segment, the inward-facing spines meshing like the fingers of 2 hands laced together, caging a soft body and bringing it down to the waiting mouth. And the deepest instruction for building any such thing, a jointed structure that juts out from the body and reaches, with a base that is one kind of tissue and a far tip that is another, is older than the parting of that animal's line from yours. A family of genes, the one called distal-less chief among them, switches on at the growing end of a limb and marks it out, saying in effect, this is the part that reaches. And that same ancient marker patterns the tip of the predator's grasping arm and the tip of the arm you have just raised in the dark, by one shared and very old logic of how a body sends a part of itself out to seize the world. For most of a century, having finally assembled the creature, we proceeded to over-arm it. The textbook Anomalocaris was the destroyer of the trilobites, a meter-long terror that cracked armored prey like nuts, and the round bite marks scarring so many trilobite shells were laid, almost by reflex, at its door. The trouble is that when researchers at last put the weapon to the test, when Russell Bicknell and his colleagues a few years ago rebuilt the appendages inside a computer and loaded them as a struggling hard-shelled animal would load them, the legend buckled along with the model. The grasping arms, flexed against rigid armor, would have strained and split. The ring of mouth plates, for all its rim of teeth, most likely could not close hard enough to breach a trilobite at all. The animal we had crowned the breaker of shells was, on the evidence of its own anatomy, almost certainly unable to eat the very prey we had given it. It looks, instead, to have been a specialist of soft flesh. A swift and accurate taker of worms and unshelled swimmers, its arms exactly suited to caging things that did not fight back with stone. And it was smaller than the legend had made it, nearer the length of your forearm than the length of a person, a third to perhaps half a meter of muscle and flap. None of this is a failure of the animal. It is only the ordinary truth that selection does not forge optimal weapons, but adequate ones, hemmed in on every side by the materials to hand, by ancestry, by the plain fact that an arm tuned to hold soft prey gently cannot also be a nutcracker. Some of its wider kin did take the armored road on sturdier mouthparts built for crushing. This one simply was not made that way. The perfection was never in the creature. It was in us, a clean, fearsome story we had laid down over an animal that turned out to be messier and smaller and far more interesting than the story allowed. And still it changed everything, precisely because it did not need to be perfect to matter. A large, mobile, sharp-eyed predator working the open water for the first time was a force the whole community had to answer, whatever the fine print of its diet. And the answering is written all through the bodies that shared its sea, in thickened shells and lengthened spines, in the new habit of burrowing out of sight, in the retreat of the soft and the slow into transparency and the dark. The long escalation in armor and sense now had something with a face at the top of it. Yet the feeling this animal finally leaves, once the legend is set aside, is not terror. It is a strange and almost tender closeness. The more carefully we look, the smaller the legend grows. Smaller in its body, milder in its diet, far less certain in every confident line the old books drew around it, and that shrinking turns out to be a kind of kinship. And there is no reason to suppose we have finished. The picture we hold now is the best reading of the evidence we have, not the last word, and some of it will surely look, a century from now, as quaint as the abnormal shrimp looks to us today. The first great hunter was not a flawless engine loosed upon the world. It was a limited, specialized, mortal creature doing only what its particular body permitted, assembled by the same patient tinkering that shaped the prey it chased and that shaped the very hand you are lying here, even now, slowly opening and closing in the dark. For all that we had to unlearn about it, though, the hunter in the end stayed legible. It resisted our reading, but it yielded to it. Once the pieces were set, the right way round, it resolved into something we could recognize. A predator, a swimmer, an animal of a kind the living world still holds. The harder trouble was waiting in the same grey shale, in the creatures that never resolved into anything familiar at all. Bodies with 5 eyes where there ought to be 2, with a clawed nozzle for a face, with stiff spines for walking legs and soft waving tentacles down the back. With the hunter, the question had only ever been how to reassemble a known kind of animal. With these, the question was about to become whether they were a known kind of animal, whether they belonged to any branch anywhere on the tree that anyone could yet put a name to. Split the right slab of grey shale, and a face looks back at you that has no business existing. Pressed flat into the rock, fine as a pencil sketch, is an animal a few centimeters long with 5 eyes, not 2, 5, raised on little stalks above its head, and reaching out in front of it a long flexible hose that ends where you might expect a mouth, in a small grasping claw lined with teeth. The mouth itself sits tucked underneath and points backwards, the wrong way entirely. The creature is called Opabinia, and when the paleontologist Harry Whittington first stood up before a room of his colleagues in the early 1970s and showed them his careful reconstruction of it, the room laughed. They took it for a joke. No animal, surely, was built like that, and yet there it was in the stone, and is still a real thing that really lived and really swam this sea. When the laughter faded, the animal still had a living to explain, and the long-clawed hose makes good sense as a tool, a flexible arm for reaching into burrows and crevices, plucking soft prey from the mud and folding back to pass it down to that backward-facing mouth. Opabinia was only the opening of the trouble. From the same beds came a creature so strange that the man who first described it, Simon Conway Morris, named it for the quality of a hallucination. Hallucigenia, a slender thing the length of a thumbnail, ringed along its back with a double row of rigid spines and bearing beneath a row of soft, waving appendages. He drew it the only way that seemed to make sense, walking on the stiff spines as though on stilts, with the soft tentacles wafting uselessly along its top, each one baffling everybody, tipped with a tiny mouth of its own. It was a monster by any reckoning, and it was also, as it turned out, entirely upside down. Years later, with finer specimens and sharper eyes, the animal was righted. The spines were not legs but armor, carried on the back where armor belongs, and the waving tentacles were the legs, paired and clawed, walking properly underneath. And then it had to be turned end for end as well, because the blob long taken for its head proved to be no head at all, merely a dark stain of decay squeezed from the body. While the true head, when Martin Smith and Jean-Bernard Caron finally found it a decade ago, came complete with a pair of simple eyes and a ring of needle-fine teeth. We had reconstructed the animal upside down and back to front at once, wrong on very nearly every axis a body has. Set upright and pointed the right way, it makes sudden, quiet sense. A small, soft-bodied grazer, clinging to sponges or picking at the dead, hoisting a palisade of spines against a sea that had lately filled with things that bite. There were others. Wiwaxia, a slug-shaped grazer plated in overlapping scales and raising 2 rows of upright blades like a creature wearing knives for a coat, working the microbial films of the seafloor with a mouth that already worked rather like a snail's. And it is precisely that snail-like mouth, that little rasping apparatus, which gives the animal away and lets us file it against every first impression among the early kin of mollusks. Set side by side, the cast of this sea can feel like a deliberate gallery of the impossible. And yet, press a hand to your own face for a moment in the dark, and you will find, among all that strangeness, something they shared with you. Notice where your senses live. Your eyes, your ears, your nose, the taste on your tongue, every one of them crowded into the single forward end of you, the head now resting on the pillow, while the long trailing remainder carries almost none. That crowding is neither an accident nor a thing unique to you. It has a name, cephalization, the gathering of the senses and of the nerves needed to read them into the leading end of a body, and it appears wherever animals travel steadily in one direction, because the end that goes first is the end that meets the world, and it pays to learn what you are moving into a moment before you arrive. With the senses came the first knot of nerves to make sense of them, the deep beginning of the very thing you are thinking with now. Opabinia, for all its oddity, was obeying that same rule exactly. It simply mounted 5 eyes at the front, where you carry 2. It is tempting, faced with this parade, to picture evolution in some wild and inventive mood, dreaming up monsters for the sheer extravagance of it. But strangeness is not a thing that can be made, because nothing is ever favored simply for being strange. What survives is whatever works, and every one of these animals worked, each fitted neatly to a life, grazing, hunting, clinging, defending, that its peculiar body carried out perfectly well. 2 quieter truths lie behind the spectacle. The first is that most of the monstrousness is in the eye that beholds it. We look back from one slender surviving branch, and everything growing off the others looks outlandish for no better reason than that it is not us, distance mistaken for deformity. The second is that the body-building machinery was, in this early stretch, still loosely strung. The ancient toolkit was being mixed and matched in a system not yet narrowed into the rigid channels that later development would run in, so that ordinary tinkering could throw together combinations a more constrained world would simply never allow. What is loose can later tighten, and over the ages that followed, development did settle into fewer and deeper channels, which is one reason a body assembled this freely feels so wholly of its moment and no other. The spined back, the 5 eyes, the clawed and waving legs are byproducts of that early looseness and of our own long hindsight. They are not designs, and they are not freaks. Nothing ever set out to make a monster. And the kindest correction of all is to the word we reached for first. These were never monsters, for a monster is a thing apart, a thing from outside, and not one of these animals came from outside anything. They are relations. Hallucigenia, righted at last, turns out to sit close to the velvet worms that still creep tonight through the leaf litter of tropical forests on soft clawed legs. Opabinia is a cousin of the open water hunter and, reaching further, of every crab and spider and fly, Wiwaxia keeps its company among the snails and the marine worms. Lay them on the tree of life, and the monsters quietly become kin. Strange-looking limbs of families that are still here, still all around us. To meet them as monsters is to hold them at arm's length. To meet them as cousins is to feel the whole family draw closer, to recognize in the five-eyed and the spine-backed and the knife-coated not aliens but elders, distant branches of your own kind, sharing your sea and your toolkit, and far enough back your blood. We called them monsters because we could not yet place them, and the strangeness was never a property they possessed. It was only the measure of our own distance from them, the width of a gap we had not yet learned to cross. And there is one last animal worth finding in that crowded rock, though it is the easiest of all to overlook, for it had none of the qualities that make the others unforgettable. No eyes to speak of, no armor, no spines, no claws, no flourish of any kind, only a thin, flattened ribbon of a body, a couple of inches long, with a faint, stiffening line running its whole length and a neat series of muscle blocks ranked along either side of it. Beside the gallery of the marvelous, it is nothing, a drab little smear a collector might brush away while reaching for something better. It promised nothing, and to any eye in that sea, or for long ages after, it was no one at all. And yet, of every creature settling onto that ancient floor, this plain and forgettable sliver is the one in which we have the deepest stake. Because it's lined by no plan and no merit that anyone then or since could ever have foreseen happens in the end to be ours. Go back, then, to the plainest animal in that rock, the thin swimming ribbon that drew no eye and promised nothing, and watch it move. It is perhaps 4 centimeters long, narrow and flattened from side to side like a blade of grass, translucent enough that the light comes half through it, and it swims low above the mud with a steady flexing of its whole body, a shallow curve running head to tail and back again. It has no jaws, no shell, no spines, no grasping arms. Its eyes, if it owns them at all, are next to nothing. Lift it from the stone today, and you would be forgiven for passing it over as its first finders did, who set it down without much thought as one more kind of worm. The animal has a name now, Pikaia, and it would be hard to design a creature less likely by the look of it to matter to anyone. And yet it was not quite the worm it was taken for, because hidden inside it, running the length of its body, was a single quiet innovation that bends everything that comes afterward. It was a slender, flexible rod, the notochord firm enough to refuse being squashed end to end and supple enough to bend, and ranked alongside it were blocks of muscle in a neat, repeating row. On its own, a row of muscles can do no more than shorten a body, but pulling against a rod that will not compress, those blocks could throw the body into smooth traveling waves, left and then right and then left again. And so the animal swam, not by beating limbs or rippling a fringe of flaps, but by flexing a stiffened core of its own, the very oldest version of the motion you yourself would make slipping through dark water tonight. Something very like it is alive at this moment, half buried in clean sand on shallow seabeds the world over. The lancelet, a small, near-transparent, almost faceless creature that swims in just this way, on just such a rod, and has never troubled to build anything more. A living photograph of roughly what your own ancestors looked like long before they were anything you would recognize. A small, soft cousin of Pikaia, laid down in what is now southern China and called Haikuichthis, had already carried the same idea a step further, gathering itself ahead at the front and arching over its nerve cord the first faint slivers of bone, the earliest rough draft of a backbone. Neither animal was the ancestor of the other. They are 2 windows onto a single modest experiment. The chordates, going quietly about the business of being small and soft and easy to eat in a sea that had grown extremely good at eating. Set that experiment against the company it kept, and its prospects looked dimmer still. This was the sea of the great open water hunter, of the armoured legions plated and spined, of the dazzling cousins with their 5 eyes and their coats of blades, a world of bodies built to impress, to dominate, to devour, or to avoid being devoured. The chordates were none of these. They were scarce and soft and defenceless. They ruled nothing, outnumbered nothing, frightened nothing at all. Had you drifted above that seabed 500 million years ago and been asked to wager on which of all these lineages would still be here in the unimaginable distance of the present, which would come to fill the rivers, crawl out onto the land, rise into the air, and at the very last sit up and turn its gaze back to this drowned and fossilized morning and labour to read it? Nothing on the floor of that sea would have turned your eye towards the thin swimming ribbon. No one would have bet on it. And that precisely is what your own lineage was. A small, unpromising thing that no one would have backed, getting quietly by at the ragged edge of someone else's epic. It is worth asking why that should move us at all, and worth asking honestly because the feeling is real and the reasons we usually reach for are not. We badly want our beginnings to be grand. We tell this story, almost without noticing we are doing it, as though the whole long Cambrian were an overture composed for us, every armoured monster and ingenious eye a step on a stair climbing patiently towards the human being lying here in the dark. But nothing was climbing, and nothing was being built towards anything. The little swimmer was not a promise the world had undertaken to keep. It was not the seed of a destiny. It was an animal among animals, no more chosen and no more aimed at the future than the trilobite that may have swallowed it, or the slug grazing the mat beside it. There was no plan in which it starred. Why, then, does it comfort us rather than diminish us to know this? Because the grand version, looked at squarely, was never a gift but a weight, the heavy flattery of being the point, the purpose, the thing it was all secretly for. To set that down, to accept that you were neither aimed at nor awaited, is not to be made small. It is to be set loose. And notice, even as we say unpromising, that the word is ours and not the animal's. Nothing about that little swimmer was lacking. It was not a failed draft of something finer, not a rough sketch of a fish or a person waiting to be corrected and improved. It was whole, and it was good at being exactly what it was, and it would have gone on being that and nothing else for as long as the sea permitted, serenely indifferent to the cities and the symphonies that lay, by the sheerest accident, somewhere far down one branch of its descendants. We call it unpromising only because we read it backwards, starting from the single outcome that happens to include us and scoring the creature by a race it never knew it was entered in. Let the backward reading fall away and the animal stands forward in its own right. And so, oddly, do you, no longer the finish line of anything, simply the latest living shape of a very old and very patient way of being alive. And the most remarkable part is that the small life never did stop, and you can feel the proof of it without leaving your bed. That stiffening rod was too deep and too useful an idea ever to be discarded. Across the hundreds of millions of years that followed, the lineage raised a column of bone around it, ring upon ring, vertebra upon vertebra, until the rod itself was all but taken apart and replaced by the very spine it had once stood in for. But not quite all of it. A little of that ancient rod was sealed away, still living, in the soft heart of each cushion between your vertebrae, the nucleus pulposus. The pressurized gel at the core of every spinal disc is the surviving scrap of the notochord, the same tissue handed down unbroken from the Cambrian swimmer into the small of your back. Your spine does not look like the stiffening rod of a soft sea creature. It looks built, engineered, nothing like a worm. Yet the evidence of where it came from is folded away inside it, an inheritance you cannot see but can certainly feel, for it is that displaced old gel, bulging out where the years have worn its wall thin, that turns a slipped disc into such misery. Lie still and follow the long curve of your back where it meets the bed, and understand that you are resting upon the direct descendant of a rod that first stiffened a small swimming thing 500 million years ago, a rod that has been present in some form in every single body standing in the line between that animal and you, never once absent, never once failing to be passed on, because had the chain parted even a single time at any point across that vast and patient stretch, there would be no one lying here tonight to feel the ache of it. You are the far end of an unbroken thread, and it asks nothing of you now. It only lies there along your spine, the oldest quiet thing in you, holding you upright, letting you sleep. Reach back, if you can manage it without disturbing the warmth of the bed, and run your fingers down the center of your own spine, that ridge of small, hard knuckles, one after another, descending from the base of your skull to the base of your trunk. Feel how it is made, not as a single carved pillar, the way you might design a thing meant to hold a body upright, but as a row, a stack of separate repeated pieces threaded one on the next, like beads strung along a cord. It is worth dwelling on that, because it is the first entry in a strange inventory. If you handed this body to an engineer and called it a finished design, they would scarcely know where to begin their objections. And the deepest reason is that it is not a design at all. It is an inheritance, retrofitted across 500 million years, and the whole of that history is still legible in you tonight, if you know where to feel for it. Start with the row itself. You are, beneath the smooth covering of skin, a segmented animal, built like an earthworm or a centipede or that small Cambrian swimmer from a series of near-identical modules repeated down a line. The vertebrae are the obvious ones, but the pattern runs everywhere once you notice it. Your ribs march down in pairs, segment by segment. The muscles of your abdomen are divided into the blocks that, on a very lean body, show through as the famous rows of a six-pack, not so much a feat of fitness as your own segmentation made briefly visible, and at every level a pair of nerves branches from the cord to serve its own narrow band of body so faithfully that a shingles rash erupting along the territory of a single one of those nerves will trace a clean stripe around you that maps the border of one ancient segment. All of it comes from the somites, the little blocks of tissue that pinch off one behind the other as an embryo lengthens, the very same repeating block logic that once ranked the muscles along the flank of the notochord-bearing ribbon 500 million years ago. The build is quick and cheap precisely because it is modular, the one unit stamped out again and again, which is also why a single pinched root at a single level can send pain firing down one leg and leave the other untouched. You never stopped being a segmented sea creature, you merely grew a smoother wrapping around the fact. Now consider the eye, which fares no better under inspection, and arguably worse. For all that it is forever held up as nature's masterwork, the vertebrate retina is, put plainly, installed back to front. The cells that actually catch the light face away from it, towards the rear of the eye, so that every particle of light entering you must first pass through a thicket of nerve wiring and a mesh of blood vessels before it can reach the receptors waiting behind them. And where all that wiring gathers to leave the eye and run for the brain, it punches a clean hole straight through the light-sensing sheet. A blind spot, a small patch of pure nothing planted in the middle of each eye's vision, which you have never once noticed only because the brain quietly invents whatever ought to be there. You are, in a small and constant way, always looking at a picture your own brain has finished for you. No engineer alive would wire a camera with its sensor turned to face the wall and the cabling strung across the lens, and yet to call it simply bad design, as those fond of the argument like to, is to miss the better and stranger truth. It is not bad, it is old. The octopus, which arrived at its own camera eye entirely separately, wired its the sensible way round, receptors to the light, No tangle in front, no blind spot anywhere, which tells us the inversion was never necessary, only the particular accident of how our kind of eye happens to fold itself together in the embryo. And evolution, which cannot go back and relay a wiring loom once it is set, did something cleverer instead. When researchers looked closely, some 15 years ago, they found that special long cells threaded down through the tangle, the Muller cells, were acting as living optical fibers, gathering the light at the surface and piping it cleanly past the obstruction to the receptors at the back. The eye is not a flaw. It is a frozen accident, brilliantly patched. And that distinction between a thing badly made and a thing inherited and then worked around turns out to be the whole quiet secret of how a body like yours comes to exist. There is a deeper inheritance still, stranger than either, and it is written not in any single organ, but in the very orientation of you. Look at an insect and trace its plan. The main nerve cord runs along its belly, and the great vessel that serves it as a heart runs along its back. Now, trace your own. Your spinal cord runs along your back, and your heart sits forward towards the front of you. The two layouts are upside down with respect to one another, and it is not a loose resemblance, but something the genes themselves confirm. For the proteins that mark one side of the body from the other are the same proteins in a fly and in you, only with their instructions, top for bottom, swapped. 2 centuries ago, a French naturalist, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, was mocked for proposing that a lobster lying on its back is arranged rather like a vertebrate. The molecules have since shown that he was reaching towards something his colleagues could not yet see. And it must be said, honestly, this remains a hypothesis, and a contested one. There is live argument about whether the great centralized nerve cord arose only once, or was assembled more than once over independently, and not every detail of the inversion sits comfortably. But the signature in your axis is real enough to be unsettling. In the most literal architectural sense, you may be an animal that turned itself over in some unwitnessed deep time moment and simply never turned back. Lay it all out on the bench, then a spine that is a stack of repeats, an eye wired inside out and rescued by a trick, a whole body perhaps flipped clean over. And the verdict could not be plainer. No one drew up this thing. It was inherited and altered and patched and compromised at every level, and each compromise is a line of history you can read by touch in the dark. But the feeling that ought to leave you is not disappointment, and certainly not the urge to find fault with your own back. These are not defects to be ashamed of. They are relics. The Cambrian is not behind you in time only. It is inside you now, in the beads of your spine and the blind spot in your eye and the upside-down map of your chest. And to lie here and feel for it is to find that you are less a design than an heirloom, a living museum of 500 million years, carrying the whole long improvised story forward without the smallest effort, simply by breathing in the dark. And once you have truly felt that, once the body stops seeming like a summit that was climbed to and begins to seem like a history that was merely accumulated, a very old and very familiar picture starts to look badly wrong. The picture of life as a ladder, a steady upward climb of ever finer creatures, rung above rung, rising in orderly procession towards something at the very top that looks naturally a great deal like us. It is one of the oldest pictures we own and one of the hardest to set down. Life as a ladder, a staircase of being that begins somewhere low and simple and climbs, rung by patient rung, up through worms and fish and lumbering reptiles and warm, clever beasts, until it arrives, a little out of breath but plainly on purpose, at a top rung where something upright and recognizably like us has been waiting all along to be the point of the whole ascent. You have seen the cartoon 1,000 times. The stooped ape on the left, the parade of slowly straightening figures, the confident strider at the right, who is, of course, you. You have seen it so often that it does not feel like a diagram at all. it feels like something remembered, and it is wrong. Not wrong in its details, but wrong in its whole shape, a trick of the single angle you happen to be looking from. The man who did the most to take the ladder apart was a paleontologist who spent his career looking at the very animals we imagine ourselves to have left behind. In his 1989 book Wonderful Life, Stephen Jay Gould took the strange creatures of the Burgess Shale, the ones redescribed across the 1970s and 80s by Harry Whittington and his younger colleagues Derek Briggs and Simon Conway Morris, and used them to make an argument that ran exactly opposite to the staircase. The Cambrian Sea, he said, did not hold a few simple forms huddled near the bottom of a rising sequence. It held more fundamentally different kinds of animal architecture than the whole of the world's oceans hold today. To feel the force of that, you have to prize apart two ideas that ordinary language keeps shoving together. One is diversity. How many different species there are, the sheer head count of distinct living things. The other is disparity. How many fundamentally different ways of building a body are on the table, how far apart the basic blueprints stand from one another. A pond holding 1,000 kinds of beetle is enormously diverse and almost completely undisparate because every one of those 1,000 is a variation on a single deep theme. The Cambrian was the reverse. Not so many species, perhaps, but the blueprints themselves were flung absurdly wide, mouths and limbs and eyes and segments combined in arrangements that have no living equivalent at all. The textbook picture had always been a cone. A narrow point at the beginning, a handful of simple ancestors, widening steadily upward and outward as time added variety until it opened into the broad, rich present. More creatures, more designs, more everything, the diagram fattening as it rose. Gould turned the cone upside down and then cut it off at the knees. Disparity, he argued, did not accumulate slowly towards the present. It arrived early, almost all at once, and then it was savagely pruned. He called the pruning decimation, and he was careful that the word should carry no flavor of improvement. The forms that vanished were not knocked out by better forms. Most simply went, in a great culling that kept no obvious account of merit, and the few surviving blueprints are not the victors of a tournament. They are the leftovers of a bonfire. Picture it then, less as a climbing ladder and more as a lawn that came up thick and wild in the spring, was mown nearly to the soil, and then let its few uncut blades grow tall. All the later richness of animal life, every beetle and bird and whale and reader of this sentence, is variation worked inside the narrow handful of designs that happened to survive the mowing. The branching had already happened. What came after was mostly elaboration within the survivors. And this is where the ladder quietly shows you what it really is. The sense of a climb, the feeling of a direction running from then to now and aimed squarely at us, is not a property of the history at all. It is a byproduct of where you are standing to look at it. You are perched on one of the surviving blades of grass, peering back down its length, and from that vantage, the single line connecting the deep past to your own feet looks like the main road, the trunk route, the purpose. That is not the main road, though. It is simply the only road still visible from your own twig, because the dozens of other roads ended in silence and left nobody standing on them to call themselves central. The branches that died took their narrators with them. The direction is painted on afterwards by the survivor, looking back. Run your eye the other way, forward from the Cambrian, knowing nothing of what is coming, and there is no top, no target, no rung set above the rest. There is only a bush throwing out branches in every direction at once, most of which stop. Now, honesty demands a turn here, because Gould's strong version of this did not entirely survive the scrutiny of his own colleagues, and watching it get corrected is, if anything, the better story. Gould had implied that many of the Burgess oddities were each a separate grand experiment, lonely kingdoms of design with no living kin, dozens of major branches lost outright. Through the 1990s and after, the people who knew those fossils best took a harder second look. Simon Conway Morris, Derek Briggs, Richard Fortey, Graham Budd and others showed that a great many of the so-called weird wonders were not isolated dead ends at all. They were stem group animals, early unfinished offshoots sitting low on branches we do recognize, the first rough drafts of the lineages that lead to the arthropods and the rest. They were not alien phyla. They were our own familiar groups, caught before they had settled into their familiar shapes. So the most extreme reading, runaway disparity, an eruption of utterly unrelated body plans, nearly all of which perished, was walked back. But notice carefully what the correction touched and what it left alone. It revised the mechanism and left the shape standing. Whether those creatures were separate kingdoms or early twigs on branches, we know the figure is still a branching bush and never a rising stair. The survivors are still survivors rather than champions. Gould may have overstated how strange the strangeness was. He was not wrong that there is no ladder and no top and no one waiting at it. The science grew more accurate and the staircase still did not come back, which leaves you exactly where the honest version of this story has to leave you. Not at the summit of an ascent, but partway out along one branch among many. In that early sea, your own lineage was the apex of nothing. The chordates were a thin, unshowy branch, represented by a few small swimming slivers easy to lose in the crowd, one modest design in a wild field of designs, wearing no badge that marked it for a future. It carried no rank. It carried only a kit. That kit is still in you, and it is worth feeling for because it is the address of your branch written into your body. Lay a hand at the back of your neck and run it down your spine. The thing that makes you a chordate is not your cleverness and not the fact that you stand upright. It is older and plainer than either. It is a nerve cord run down the back rather than the belly, a stiffening rod laid beneath it, which in you persists only as the soft cores cushioned between your vertebrae. A tail that, before you were born, reached out past the opening of your gut. A throat that, for a few early weeks, was pleated with the same arches every member of your branch has worn since the Cambrian. That bundle is not finer than the jointed limb kit of the arthropod or the soft, muscular kit of the mollusk. It is simply the one your particular surviving blade of grass happened to carry up out of the mowing. You are not standing at the top of the design. You are living on the inside of one. And once the ladder is gone, and the climb with it, a colder question moves into the space it leaves behind. If the survivors were never the best, but only the remainder, if your whole branch came through the great culling, carrying nothing but a kit and a measure of luck, then what exactly settled that it would be your branch and not one of the dozens that fell silent? Was there something in that thin, chordate sliver that genuinely earned its way forward, some quiet advantage that would tell in its favor every time? Or did it merely happen to be standing where the blade swung wide, spared by nothing it could take any credit for? Skill or accident? The whole meaning of the Cambrian turns on which. We were left holding a hard question. Was it skill that carried a lineage through the culling or only luck? And the living world offers at first glance what looks like a clean and almost uncanny answer in favor of something better than luck. Better even than skill. It looks like a plan. Because all across the spread of life, creatures with no shared history and no possible contact keep arriving, alone and from opposite directions, at precisely the same solution, as though each had been quietly handed the same set of drawings. Take the shape of a fast hunter in open water. A shark is a fish, an ichthyosaur was a reptile that went back to the sea. A dolphin is a mammal that did the same thing tens of millions of years later. A tuna is a fish again, on a track all its own. Oceans of time and every accident of ancestry separate them, and yet set them side by side, and they are nearly one animal. The same torpedo body, the same stiff crescent tail, the same single fin standing up off the back. None copied another. Each was carved, alone and in the dark, into the one shape that moving water will permit a large thing that wants to move through it quickly. The man who would have warned you hardest against reading a plan into that was Stephen Jay Gould, whose mown-down bush still surrounds us. He answered our question with a single image that has never quite let go of anyone who hears it. "Replay the tape of life," he said. "Wind the whole reel back to that crowded early sea, wipe everything that followed, and let it run forward a second time from the same mark, and we do not come back. Not us, and not anything close enough to us to know what the word was meant to mean. Some wholly other living world would run on in our place and never once miss what it had never made. The small accidents that had decided which branches lived and which were cut down would simply fall differently. A different thin sliver would inherit the water, and the entire tower of backboned life, fish, frogs, you, would never be raised, because the twig it grew from would have been among the casualties. History, in his telling, is very nearly all accident, and you are here reading this only because one unlikely ticket against the run of the odds came good. And that would settle it, coldly, in favor of accident, were it not that the pattern keeps coming and keeps refusing to look like accident. Powered flight, the real beating kind, was invented from nothing by the insects, and then again by the flying reptiles, and again by the birds, and a fourth time, wholly separately, by the bats. Echolocation, the trick of seeing the black with sound, was hit upon on its own by bats in the night air and by toothed whales in the lightless deep. And not merely the trick, but the machinery beneath it, for a 2010 study led by Ying Liu found that a single hearing protein called prestin had been rewritten in nearly the same places and the same way in both of those impossibly distant lineages. A bat and a dolphin reached, each in ignorance of the other, for the very same molecule, and bent it to the very same end. Lay all of it out together, and the pull to read a purpose into the thing becomes almost irresistible. A target the whole process is being drawn towards, a maker with a short list of favorite answers reaching for them over and over. That reading is the one this whole question turns on, and it is wrong. Nothing is being aimed at, and there is no favoring hand reaching anywhere. There is only a world that holds very few good answers inside it. The laws of moving fluid allow just so many shapes that go fast through water. The demands of staying up allow just so many ways to build a wing that works. The physics of sound bouncing off a moving body allow just so many ways to hear it return. The space of things that work is narrow, far, far narrower than the space of things that can be tried, and so blind variation, pouring in from every side at once, is forced again and again down the same handful of channels, not because anything steers it, but because every other channel is a wall. Convergence is not the fingerprint of a plan. It is the fingerprint of constraint. What looks like a destination is only the place a river could not help but reach because its banks had left it nowhere else to run. This is the case built patiently and over many years by Simon Conway Morris, the same paleontologist who once helped take Gould's weird wonders apart, now turned to making the strongest argument against Gould's tape. In his 2003 book, Life's Solution, he turns the whole thought experiment inside out. Run it again, he says, and the constraints are still in place, the channels still narrow, the few good answers still as good as they ever were. So you would get eyes again, and fast swimmers again, and warm, quick, sharp-toothed hunters again, and in time, very probably, large brains and the restless kind of intelligence that ends up reaching once more for sentences. Not the same species, nothing so precise, but something you could recognize, something you might look in the eye. The deepest mark of which side of life you fall on carries this very argument folded inside it, written into the first hours of your existence, when you were no more than a hollow ball of cells, with nothing yet that could be called a front or a back. The first opening to form in you, the first place the sphere folded inward and broke through, did not become your mouth. It became your anus. The mouth came afterwards, opening second at the far end. It sounds like a small and faintly comic detail, and it is in fact the badge of an entire dynasty. The animals that build mouth first are one great branch of the kingdom: the insects, the snails, the earthworms. The animals that open the back door first, the deuterostums, the second mouths, are the other branch, and it is the one you belong to. Which means that this one decision, taken in the dark before you had any shape to lose, files you in the same drawer as the starfish and the sea urchin, and makes a slow, spiny, five-armed thing on the seabed a nearer relative of yours than any insect that has ever lived. It feels arbitrary, and in a sense it is, a developmental coin that landed one way rather than the other in some ancestor more than 500 million years back. But it has held, unbroken, down every line that ancestor founded, from then until the cells that became you. Luck, frozen hard into law and carried in you still. It is an honest thing to admit that a reader can go back to both men more than once and change sides more than once and still not find it an easy thing to set down. Read Gould, and you are sure we are a fluke and ought to feel the cold of it. Read Conway Morris, and you are sure that something like us was always going to surface somewhere, that the Narrows were bound to deliver a mind eventually. And here is the temptation most worth distrusting: the wish for that second answer to be the true one, because it is the more comforting answer, and wanting a conclusion is the surest way there is to talk yourself into it. So, holding that wish at arm's length, here is the most that can honestly be said. The two men are not answering the same question. Gould is asking who lives. Conway Morris is asking what the living become. The culling itself, which twig drew the lucky ticket, does look to have been steeped in accident, just as Gould insisted. Nothing about the caudate sliver had it marked for rescue, and replayed it might well have gone down, but once a lineage is through and out in a world of water and weight and prey, the walls close in around it, and what it can turn into is no longer open at all. The players are chosen by luck. The game they then play is shaped by law. That your branch came through was a coin toss. That your branch, having come through, arrived at something close to the body you are wearing. That was very nearly bound to happen. So the survivors of the Great Mowing were marked twice over, lucky beyond reckoning to be there at all, and then bent by the plain, narrow physics of the world into shapes we would one day know on sight. But the sea that made them was neither safe nor permanent. The same restlessness that had filled it so suddenly with bodies would, given time enough, set about emptying a great many of them out again. Wind the reel forward now, past the last of the soft, strange Burgess animals, past the long, warm noon of that first great age of complex life, and the crowded oceans begin, for the first time in the whole history of animals, to fail, until the creatures that had only lately learned how to be animals at all come up against the first of the great dyings their world had ever had to live through. There is a kind of fossil that records not a life but an ending, and one of the oldest examples sits in pale stone laid down around 513 million years ago. It is a reef, the first reef that animals ever built, raised by creatures called archaeocyaths, little cups and cones of mineral no longer than your finger that grew side by side and wall against wall until they made the first living architecture the sea had ever held. Run your eye up through the rock and you can watch them thrive, bed after bed of them, a city in cross-section. And then, in a band you could cover with one hand, they stop. Above that line, the reef builders are simply gone, and the stone that follows is the dull, dark, even grey of mud that settled in water with almost nothing living in it. Paleontologists call the event that line marks the Sinsk, after the Siberian rocks where it was first read, and it was among the very first of the great dyings, the first time the young world of animals discovered that it could also be unmade. What did the unmaking was, of all things, a shortage of the one substance that had made the whole adventure possible. The oceans lost their oxygen. Across wide shelves, the water turned slack and stagnant and faintly sulphurous, the breathable layer thinning from below until it pressed up into the shallows where everything lived, and the animals that needed oxygen to be large and quick and hungry found there was less and less of it to be had. The geologist Rachel Wood, who has spent years reading the chemistry locked in these early reefs, has traced how the sea's oxygen rose and fell in great slow tides through the Cambrian, and how the fallings line up again and again with the dyings. What unmade them was nothing violent, no fire, no sudden dark, only a sea that went quietly slack, a slow stilling, a withdrawal of the thing that bodies run on. And bodies, in their millions, slowing with it, and settling, and not rising again. You can feel, if you sit still for a moment, the exact thing those animals were losing. Let your breathing go on as it has gone on all day without your attention. That soft, automatic rise and fall you almost never have to think about. Now hold it, gently, and wait. Within half a minute, something begins to speak in you. Not in your lungs, as it happens, but lower and older, a quiet insistence that builds towards a kind of hunger, until the urge to breathe arrives with a force that has nothing to do with willpower at all. That insistence is the oldest alarm your body owns. It is what an oxygen-starved animal feels, stripped of every comfort but the bare chemical fact, and it is what the Sinsk seas rang, slowly and without malice, in body after body across whole drowned coastlines. The part of you that rings that alarm and that is keeping your breath going even now while you read sits at the very base of your brain, and it was built in a way older than almost anything else about you. Early in the womb, the hindbrain does not form as one smooth piece. It lays itself down as a row of segments, rhombomeres, 7 or 8 little beads strung head to tail, each given its own address by the same deep head-to-tail logic that orders the rest of the body along its length. Out of that segmented strip comes the machinery of the most automatic things you do, and tucked into its lowest part is a small knot of cells that sets the rhythm of your breathing, firing in the dark whether you attend to it or not. That arrangement, that beaded hindbrain with its rhythm keeper at the bottom, is shared in its bones by every backboned animal, and it was already old when the Sinsk waters went slack. The thing that would have laboured and at last failed in a suffocating Cambrian fish is, segment for segment, the thing breathing you through this sentence. It is hard not to read a purpose into a dying on this scale, to feel that the great cull must have been clearing the ground, resetting the board, sweeping out the old to make room for what was coming. The reefs fell, the story wants to say, so that something better could rise. But nothing was cleared away for anyone. The room that the survivors inherited was not made for them, it was only what happened to be left. And the catastrophe itself aimed at nothing. It was the blind byproduct of the same dull planetary housekeeping that also keeps the world alive, the slow turning of carbon and oxygen through rock and water and air, circulation faltering, nutrients shifting, the chemistry simply tipping one way instead of another. The planet was not punishing its animals and was not pruning them for improvement. It was running its ordinary cycles, and the dying fell out of them the way a shadow falls out of a moving cloud, a consequence of everything and the intention of nothing. And here, more than almost anywhere in this story, we have to be honest about how much we do not know, because at an extinction, the evidence works against us. The thing we most want to study is an absence, and absence is the hardest reading in all of geology. A gap in the rock can mean 1,000,000 deaths or only a stretch of stone that never formed or was later worn away. We argue still over what pulled the trigger. Oxygen loss is the leading suspect, but great volcanic outpourings, shifting seas and changing tides of nutrient have all been put in the dock beside it. We cannot even cleanly count the dyings. The Sinsk was one. Later in the Cambrian came others, whole waves of trilobites vanishing in eerily similar pulses, and a great swing in the chemistry of the late seas that left its mark in carbon the world over. Whether these were one long process wearing many faces or a string of separate calamities is something the field still works out, section by patient section, as fresh exposures in South China and elsewhere keep redrawing the timing and the toll. The dying is certain. Its shape, even now, is being sketched and rubbed out and sketched again. Through all of it, the slack seas, the silenced reefs, the waves of loss the rock can barely hold, one thin line went on. The small, soft-bodied chordates, your own remote kin, were never the dominant creatures of these seas and were never the ones the dying seemed to be about, and perhaps that very smallness, that habit of living quietly at the edges, was what carried them through when the grand reef cities did not. The line was drawn fine almost to breaking in those low oxygen ages. It was never quite broken. And so the sea, having lost and stilled and slowly drawn its breath again, went on holding the one unremarkable thread that had come so close to ending, and held it through the long quiet that followed on towards everything it had not yet become. Rest 2 fingers on the inside of your wrist, or against the side of your throat, and wait for the small, patient knock that is always there. That beat is the nearest edge of something very old. Not the heart itself, which is only as old as you are, but the line the heart belongs to, the living, unbroken succession of one cell giving rise to the next, which runs backward from the pulse under your fingers without a single gap, down through all the dark behind you to the very first thing on this planet that could be called alive. The crowded sea we have spent so long watching did not end when its reefs fell silent and its oxygen drained away. It went on, and after a stretch of time the mind cannot really hold, it became, among 10,000 other living things, the warm, heavy, resting body you are lying in tonight. You are not looking back at that ancient water from somewhere outside it. You are the place it has for the moment arrived. It is worth saying plainly what that means, because it is the kind of fact so large that the mind keeps sliding off it. Every living thing on Earth tonight, you and the moth at the window and the grass stiffening under the frost, is the latest link in a chain of parents and offspring that has not been broken once, not a single time, in something like 3.5, perhaps nearly 4 billion years. We do not know the exact morning life began, and we may never know it. The oldest signs are faint traces of carbon locked in some of the most ancient rocks that still survive, and careful people go on arguing, in good faith, over what those traces really mean. But wherever the first link was forged, the chain that runs from it to you was never once cut. Every ancestor you have ever had, in a relay reaching back across that gulf of time, past all counting, lived long enough to pass the thread to the next. Every one of them, without exception. Through the long freeze when the ice may have crept all the way down to the equator and turned the whole planet white. Through the slack and breathless seas we have only just left behind. Through wandering continents, through fire and cold and the falling of stones out of the sky, through every catastrophe the world could invent, not one creature in your direct line died before it had handed the thread on. Each was, in its own moment, a small and ordinary life, feeding and fleeing and managing as best it could, and each one held. The instant any single one of them had failed, one death 3 billion years ago, or 500 million, or in some forgotten century much nearer to now, the line would have gone dark there and stayed dark, and the pulse under your fingers would not be knocking in the quiet of this room. It is knocking. You are the living proof that the chain has never, in all that time, broken. You are what 3.5 billion unbroken years look like from the inside, lying down at the end of an ordinary day. And the strange, crowded sea that this whole account has circled, the Cambrian, with its armoured hunters and its first opened eyes and its riot of impossible experiments, is one particular reach of that long chain. The stretch in which the thread, having been single cells and then soft and simple things for billions of patient years, was at last drawn out into the shape of an animal with a front and a back and a cord of nerve running down its length. The body you are resting was not designed last week, nor in any age you could name. Its plan was sketched in that water by no one over millions of years, and it has been copied down to you without a break ever since. You have been carrying the Cambrian quietly inside you for the whole of your life. And tonight, perhaps for the first time, you can feel it holding still. For it is all still here, every layer of it, folded into the body lying in the dark. Lie still and take a slow inventory of yourself, and you find that you are taking an inventory of deep time, that your left side answers your right, that your whole body is folded in halves around a single invisible midline is the oldest animal decision there is, older by far than eyes or jaws or bone. The head, where your senses crowd together, and the long axis running away from it to the other end, is the same head-to-tail plan that was laid down before there were heads worth the name, each part of you still quietly told where along that line it belongs. The tube that passes clean through you, taking the world in at the top and letting it go below, is the simple plumbing of the first things that ever crawled and swam. The spine you are lying on repeats itself in segment after segment, the same single unit stamped again and again down your back, and slipped between its bones are soft, water-filled cores, the last surviving trace of the stiff rod that first won your lineage the right to be called something with a back at all. The little bones that carry every sound into your ear were once, in creatures far, far back, part of the scaffolding of a throat. The throat itself, reworked again and again, became the place from which you speak. The eyes you will close in a minute or two are focused, in the deepest logic of their design, by an arrangement that was already old when the first fish turned its gaze upon the water. Even the very first opening that formed in you before you had any shape to speak of, the one that became not your mouth but its opposite, quietly files you among one great half of the animal kingdom and away from the other. And in every cell of all of it, small engines are burning oxygen on your behalf, the descendants of a bargain struck between two kinds of life so impossibly long ago that there were as yet no animals at all for them to belong to. None of this is metaphor, and none of it is loose poetic talk. You are not the distant cousin of those ancient creatures. You are built this very night to their specifications, and not everything you carry is still in use, which turns out in the end to be the most honest evidence of all. At the very base of your spine, below the segmented bone and the cushioned cores, sits a small inward curl of fused vertebrae, a tail, shortened and folded away and leading nowhere, the silenced end of something that once streamed out behind your ancestors through open water. About your ears lie faint muscles that in a dog or a deer would turn the whole ear sharply towards a sound, and that in you can manage, at most, a useless little twitch. Across the whole surface of your skin are tiny muscles whose only task is to pull each separate hair upright when you are cold or afraid, lifting a thick coat of fur that you lost long ago and have never once missed. In the inner corner of each eye is a small, soft fold of pink, the last pale remnant of a third eyelid that other animals still sweep right across the eye. The easy word for all of this is clutter. Leftovers, junk, the body's failure to tidy up after itself, the very opposite of anything you would call designed. But that reading has it precisely backwards, because these are not failures. They are kept records. They remain not because anything still needs them, but for the single reason that they were handed down, carried along on the thread for no purpose except that they happened to come with it. And that is exactly what makes them the most truthful witnesses in the whole of your body. A useful part might always have been built fresh to meet some need. A useless one can only have been inherited. Every vestige you carry is a line of handwriting from an ancestor you will never meet, kept just legible across all that time by nothing whatever but descent. And the thread that reaches you is not yours alone. The same unbroken line runs out just as far and just as unbroken to every other living thing sharing the night with you, to the owl and the oak and the sleeping dog and the person breathing beside you, to the bacteria warm in your own gut and the lichen on the cold stone outside. Every one of them is also a current end of the same vast process, the same relay run without a single dropped baton since the beginning. Trace any two of those lines back far enough, and they meet, join, and become one. You are not the summit of that fabric, and you are not its goal. You are one living tip of it among uncountable billions, all of you equally far from the start, all of you equally the present edge of the same old, branching, patient weave. To feel small in that is to misunderstand it. To feel held by it is to understand it exactly. It would be the easiest thing in the world, lying here at the end of all of it, to let this swell into a story about purpose. To feel that a thread drawn so fine through so many disasters across so unthinkable a span must surely have been reaching towards you the whole time, that you are the thing it was always for. Let us be honest with one another here at the close, in the way this account has tried to be honest the whole way through. Even on the nights when honesty cost it a comfort, it was not reaching for you, and you are not what it was for. For very nearly the entire length of that chain, there was nothing anywhere in the world remotely like you, and at no single point along it did the thread ever bend itself on purpose in your direction. No one was drafting you. The first cell was not dreaming of you across the billions of years. The small, soft, unremarkable swimmer that carried your body plan through the Cambrian was an unpromising little thing that no one watching would have wagered a single moment upon. Every link in the chain held for its own immediate and ordinary reasons, or for no reason at all beyond plain luck, and the line arrived at you the way a long river arrives at one particular grain of sand on one particular shore, genuinely arriving there, truly after everything, and yet never for one instant aiming. And here is the thing this account did not expect to find when it first began to follow the thread, and the one piece of comfort sure enough to set down beside you as you go to sleep. That is so much better than having been aimed at. To have been planned for would be a small thing, really, and in its way a little cheap. But to be the living end of an unbroken line 3.5 billion years long, a line that never meant to arrive at you and arrived all the same, that is vast beyond any reckoning, and it is true, and it is wholly yours, and it asks nothing of you tonight at all except that you let yourself rest. The soft cores between the bones of your back, the last quiet remnant of that first stiff rod, are taking your weight at this very moment, easing under you as you settle deeper, just as some version of them has borne the weight of every creature on your branch since the very beginning of backs. The thread does not come to a stop at you. It is running through you even now, in the patient knock under your fingers, in the slow rise and fall of your breath. in the warmth of a body still quietly busy holding deep time together while you yourself do nothing at all. And when you finally loosen your grip on the day and let yourself slide down into sleep, it will not loosen its grip in turn. It will go on through the whole of the night doing the one and only thing it has ever done, which is simply to continue. You are the current living end of something unbroken and unimaginably old that never once meant to arrive at you, and yet here you are, and it is enough, and you may rest now. Close your eyes. The thread is holding. It will still be unbroken when you wake.